Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first of our series of lectures on the French Revolution. This lecture series is going to take us from the age of absolutism, so that period that includes both the medium term, one might even say long term, as well as short term causes of the revolution, the age of the Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century, all the way through to the period of the Directory, that sort of final phase of the French Revolution proper. It includes the ascent of Napoleon, but not the empire of Napoleon. So let's begin with a discussion of that of what's going on in France prior to the revolution. This is the so-called Ancien Regime. This term here is a bit of a false friend. It does not mean the ancient regime. It sort of means that, but not quite. It means the old order. Right? It's not truly ancient. It simply is really an order that has an evolution out of the Middle Ages, but is really a result of the rise of the Bourbon monarchy, the consolidation of the French state under a single monarch. Now we can see that in the late Valois period as well. We can see that with Louis the 11th and 12th. Charles the Seventh. So we could see some of those trends happening in the late Valois period, but really the idea of the old order being really a modern post-medieval French state. In particular, we're looking at a period now that is even after Louis XIV, so post 1715. And that really, once again, when the great king who really establishes French absolutism and is known for creating the absolutist state in France, Louis XIV, is dead, and it passes to his descendant, his great-grandson, Louis XV. Here we have a time in which there is an aristocratic resurgence. This happens throughout the reign of Louis XV. There is this sort of fulmination. There's these dissident figures that begin to emerge, largely throughout the Enlightenment, but really upon the death of Louis XV and the ascent of his grandson Louis XVI. This is really where we have the aristocracy saying, enough with the absolutism. We need to reassert some kind of check, some kind of break on the power of the king, and the nobility is best positioned to do that. The nobles of the robe, who had been appointed by Louis XIV and Louis XV to water down the old traditional aristocracy of France, those who had been the descendants of the feudal medieval knights and the great clans, the dukes and counts of the realm of France. The nobles of the robe had been created in order to sort of dilute the power of that older nobility of the sword. Unfortunately, by the time we get to the late 18th century, some of those nobles of the robe had already become themselves sort of aristocratic, traditional, dynastic families who held titles for more than 100 years. And so they become just as difficult, as intractable as the old nobility of the sword had been, and they no longer see themselves as being tied to the patronage of the royal family, of the monarchy, and so even the nobles of the sword, or even the nobles of the robe, try to gain a greater independence of the monarchy. Another element of this is the mechanism of governance in the French state. Of the many economic problems that the French state is facing, taxation is one of the big ones. There are very few avenues by which tax legislation can be passed outside of the taxes that were agreed upon going back centuries to the reign of Louis XIII. What institutions has the right to rule on taxations or the power of royal decrees? Well, that falls to the regional judicial courts, the so-called Parlement. The and virtually each major territory has a parlement, and they're designed as a rubber stamp for the king's decrees. They are packed with nobles of the robe, so again, they're supposed to go along with what the king says. However, the Paris Parlement begins to sort of assert its own authority as one of the few judicial voices that could potentially speak for all of France and disapprove of royal decrees, especially on taxation. In other words, the concerns of the nation that aren't maybe necessarily being met in those regional parlements, the concerns, the objections are being voiced in the Paris Parlement, which becomes this very difficult institution that French kings Louis XV and certainly Louis XVI are going to have a great deal of difficulty manipulating as they had in the past. So, in effect, what the kings must do is resort to chief ministers who can manipulate the kind of cumbersome machinery of French absolutist government, one that is laden with patronage and so on. So Louis XV appoints, in 1768, Maupeou. He attempts to abolish the Paris Parlement and create a more amenable institution, a more docile institution that will go along with the king's taxation policy. And he wants to expand taxation policy because he sees France's growing fiscal crisis after the 7 Years' War. The problem with that is that he becomes unpopular for some of his policies. Some people like the policies, a lot of people don't. Louis XVI is not a strong enough monarch, a strong enough personality to endure the unpopularity of some of those measures, so he dismisses Maupeou. The old Parlement is reinstated, and no new policy emerges, only gridlock and indecision. And there's going to be a pattern. Louis XVI is going to go through a number of ministers. Any one of them, actually, could have provided a fiscal solution to France's problems had those policies remained in place. But Louis did not do that, and so the government vacillates back and forth between various economic and political policies. Excuse me. So that's a little bit of what's happening in the late reign of Louis XV and the early reign of Louis XVI. And it brings us up to 1789. So what does France look like in 1789? It has a population of nearly 25 million people. It had grown significantly over the course of the 17th and the early 18th century. It is the wealthiest country in Europe, okay, in terms of its GNP, okay, its gross national, or its GDP, its gross domestic product, but per person not so much. There's plenty of poor Frenchmen, okay, but it certainly has the largest, most productive export economy in all of Europe. It is culturally dominant. French is the language of diplomacy, it is the language of science, it is the language of education, international correspondence, you name it. After the sort of the authors of the Enlightenment, being Locke and Newton, those two individuals, John Locke and Isaac Newton, the two Englishmen, who really establish a paradigm by which the Enlightenment will take off. The Enlightenment is really itself very much a French cultural phenomenon. So much of the culture of the 18th century revolves around the greatest state in Western Europe. The representative groups, that we might say, that exist in France in this early time period are called the estates. Okay? We have 3 estates. These recognize the 3 medieval institutions of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. So the first estate is the clergy, about 1% of the French population, owning about 20% of all land. They collect taxes called the tithe, which is a 10% contribution that's made to the church every year. This is a forcible contribution that's made. It's not voluntary as it might be today. And the clergy is exempt from taxation. those who fight, the nobility, 2 to 4% of the population, and own about 25% of all the land. So between the first two estates, almost half the land in all of France is owned by approximately 5% of the population. They have rights over their peasants for taxes, for feudal dues, the corvée, the taille, all these sorts of things. They have hunting rights and other privileges. Their parks are forbidden for peasants to enter. They are exempt from taxation themselves. A great deal goes along with being a nobleman during this time. And the third estate consists of everyone else below the rank of nobility. So, even if you are an incredibly wealthy merchant, if you are not titled, you do not have the kind of access to power that even an impoverished member of the French aristocracy would have. And that chafes a lot of those Enlightenment philosophers who come out of wealthy merchant families, but are not themselves noble, and therefore do not have the kinds of, they have access to education, but they do not actually have access to power. So they are very educated people who are shut out of the machinery of government. And they see the things that are going on, they have solutions, but their voices are not being heard. And so it's from that top tier of the Third Estate that we'll really begin to see the liberal French Revolution emerge after 1789. Again, here we have details of the Third Estate, the merchants, the professional middle class, artisans, as well as unskilled workers and peasants. They're all part of the Third Estate. They pay taxes. They have land tax. They have church tax, the tithe. They have income tax and poll tax and salt tax, the gabella. They have feudal obligations, corvée, right? Which means that, especially among the peasantry, X number of days per month are owed to your feudal lord. They have to, you have to do work for them for free, right? But again, it's this emerging middle class, this wealthy, educated class that is still excluded from political life. These are the ones who resent the privileges of the other two estates, and these will become the vocal individuals who will lead the French Revolution. All right, that's a short little introduction to what's going on in France prior to the Revolution. Now we're going to stay tuned for the short and long-term causes of the Revolution, get down to some of the really important issues. Okay, so for now, thank you for listening.